Hey everyone, and welcome back to Rudy's 1/6 World for another installment in our Retrospective Figure Showcase series. This one is going to be a little interesting, as we'll be looking at two releases from Enterbay, and they are Goku and Piccolo from the live-action Dragon Ball Evolution movie. And honestly, I'll be the first to admit, I have no idea why I picked these up. I really don't know what I was thinking. Or actually, that's a lie. This was from a period of my collecting days where I basically was just buying anything I thought looked even remotely interesting. Plus, cost-wise, figures weren't passing that $300+ threshold, so there was a little bit more disposable income. And yes, I'll walk you through the figures themselves because they're interesting releases, but this video should also serve as a bit of a self-deprecating one, because looking at these two, I just keep thinking, why? They don't really go with my collection, at least not in its current state, and the movie was horrible. On top of everything, I am not at all a Dragonball fan. It just wasn't for me. And before we go on, this video isn't meant to knock on the license at all, although I think even Dragon Ball fans at the time were in agreement that the movie was terrible and it was a disservice to the source material. Another little note, I tend to have a pretty accepting threshold when it comes to movies. Even if I know it's a bad one, I try to find something to like, or most times I'll at least be entertained. A case in point, the Spirit movie, which I rewatched as part of the Octopus review. For me, this thing was just horrible. Now, if you liked it, kudos to you. This just wasn't for me. So going back to the figures, yeah, I pre-ordered these thinking they looked really good. And at the time, Enterbay was coming onto the scene tackling new licenses, and I was definitely captivated by what they were doing. I can't remember if I picked these up after watching the movie or before. Hopefully it was before watching the movie, otherwise I definitely question myself even more. But I'm going to give myself the benefit of the doubt. So let's jump right in, and again, it makes sense to look at both of these figures together. And as you can see, they don't come with much. The Goku figure comes with some spare hands, a staff, and a display stand, as well as a Dragon Ball. The Piccolo comes with some extra gloved hands, the remaining Dragon Balls, and a pouch to store them, as well as a cloak for the figure to wear, and a stand. And boy, does this guy need it. He definitely needs a stand, and we'll go more into that later. Looking more closely at the accessories, let's start with Goku's staff. There's not much to look at here. Looks pretty decent, although maybe a little plasticky. There is some nice detail for the metal portions though, but when you compare it to a more modern release like the staff we got with the Hot Toys Shang-Chi, I think you can see that it's clearly missing some details. Then you get the spare hands, and this is where, as a figure, I do really like what we're seeing here from Enterbay. There's a lot of astounding detail in the hands, especially if you look at the paint apps around the nails, where they even showed some slight variation to really make it feel more real. The hands too, the paint on the hands themselves are done in a nice subtle way where you can see some veins underneath the skin. So overall, I think that was a great job. One thing I did notice, there is some blotchiness here, and I don't know if that was done on purpose to showcase some battle damage and bruising, or if it's just some discoloration happening with age. These figures have been stuck in their boxes since I got them back in 2009. So again, don't do what I did with these. Always check your figures. Now, moving on to Piccolo's accessories, gloved hands also look great with a lot of nice detail work and some decent sculpting to show the folds in the fabric. Next are just the rest of the Dragon Balls, and I grouped them all together here. These do look okay. They're clear molded orange plastic, molded around these star elements that were cast in. So you can see that they're essentially numbered from 1 to 6. Okay, they're not bad. The one note, not sure if it's age related, but the plastic does look like it's gotten a little bit foggy. And finally, we have to talk about the stand because it's a pretty interesting one. Not sure if it's the same stand that Enterbay still uses today with their NBA figures, but it's a heavy metal base with metal pole and metal clamp. And they're all ratcheted. While technically I think that means you could potentially lock these in place for posing, I just can't help but feel that if you don't get it exactly locked in place, you might be limited with what you can do. And I also don't like the clamp. Say what you will with Hot Toys, but at least they provide some padding with their waist clamps. Here, this just looks like it could damage the figure, and it looks like it's going to be a hassle to get it around to fit the way you want it to. Other interesting thing here is that the base does expand. Potentially, I'm guessing to avoid having the figure tip over, depending on the pose. My biggest issue here, though, is that there's just no design on the stand or anything. It just feels super bland. So let's move on to the sculpts, because I think, like with their 24 figures, this is really the highlight here for Enterbay. And first up is Goku, as portrayed by Justin Chatwin. And the sculpt looks amazing. I mean, to me, there's no mistaking who it's supposed to be. And let's start with the eyes, which look so hyper-realistic. It almost looks like glass, giving the eye that extra bit of realism. Almost like it's wet. The paintwork done on the face as well looks incredible with very subtle detailing, and I do have to say it's amazing in hand to see how good it looks. Hair is okay. I mean, it looks a little plastic, but I guess it kind of did in the movie as well. Moving on to Piccolo, it's a lot of the same points here. There is really some incredible detail work to the eyes and the ears with a slightly pointed look. Even the small indentations along his upper temples are done really well. What really sells the sculpt for me though has to be the paintwork. Whatever Enterbay was doing at the time, they were really playing around with some great layered paint, and they were really trying to replicate that realistic feel. And it's again evident in the work around the eyes, which is what makes the rest of the set unfortunately kind of disappointing, because as figures, the great sculpts are really betrayed by the rest of the package. So let's look at outfits. I think for Goku, he looks really good. I like the yellow shirt he has with the great texture and detailing here. It really was a piece that needed to get done correctly for this figure. Pants are okay, baggy and not restrictive for posability, but the boots are just horrible. I don't know if they're accurate to the movie, but they just look like blobs of plastic, and like there was no care taken with them. Only other little note here, the wristbands and the belt are made of molded plastic, and it does feel a little sticky. Not sure if that's a little melting going on or whatnot, but it's just not that impressive. Big thing with Goku, I don't like the Enterbay body, and in particular the arms look a little on the skinny side. I don't mind the exposed joints, never been a deal breaker for me, but here, if you're going to expose a joint like they did and have it look this evident, why not make it a real double joint? Instead, we're getting a single jointed elbow, and it just doesn't make sense for this kind of figure. Now, as far as Piccolo, he's an interesting one because they used a very interesting fabric that almost feels like some older drapery to make up that undershirt to the armored pieces and his pants. The armored pieces are nicely molded and do create an interesting visual, and the baggy pants do make for an interesting look overall. But again, the boots, they're horrible. And that's not an exaggeration. They just really are atrocious. They're basically blobs of pleather, and you can tell they're not even molded to fit nicely around the foot. They just look like pieces of fabric that are just floating around, and they feel like it. They feel very loose. They just look bad, and it's something I would have expected a little bit better from Enterbay here. The other thing, getting this guy to stand on his own is almost impossible. I think, I don't know if it's just that the feet don't hold the positions well, or weak joints, or the body really is terrible on these. Hopefully Enterbay's improved it since then, but it's just a hassle to get this to stand. And that's really my gripe with these figures. And it was the same issue I had with the 24 releases. It's those bodies. They just kind of stink. I think the concept of ratcheted joints is a good one to lock in your figures. But honestly, the execution here is subpar. Goku gets away with it a little bit more, being able to stand on his own, but Piccolo, it just doesn't work. Figure can barely stand, and it just doesn't look good, and it was extremely frustrating just getting him set up for some of these shots. So I won't really get into more details here about the movie or the license. This is where we're going to veer into a cautionary tale territory. I bought these just for the sake of having these cool looking figures, or at least that's what I thought at the time. Looking at them now as a more veteran collector, I do have to shake my head a little bit, because I think my current focus is on picking up figures that really relate to properties I like. Case in point, Marvel, Star Trek, Stranger Things, some older 80s movies, and so on. And sometimes the appeal of the property, the connection you have to those pieces of entertainment, do help you see these collectibles in another light. So you can overlook a soft sculpt or a poor design decision. And if you don't have a connection to a property, the figures just need to be outstanding to impress you. Here, it's a no-go on both. I just have no personal connection to the source material, and the figures just aren't great. Again, I think Enterbay was focusing very much on the sculpts, but the bodies in particular were just poorly done. I mean, case in point, these are figures that were stuck in the boxes for 14 years, essentially. And that should tell you something. So I think maybe the only piece of advice I would have for you when it comes to figure purchases, buy stuff you're really into. Buy stuff that speaks to you, especially nowadays with the cost of figures being so high. For me, honestly, I do have to say these are probably the worst figures in my collection. And actually, I have figures that I'm planning on reviewing in a bit from Sideshow, and those are the Indiana Jones, the ones from their Indiana Jones line. And when you look at those, you'll see clearly that they don't hold up at all from a sculpt perspective. They look doll-like and dated. But I think because I loved that original trilogy as much as I did, and because it was part of my growing up, those figures are actually, I'll hold them up higher than these. Also, at the time, I was just collecting and picking things up, but looking at the current status of my collection, I don't know that these fit in at all, or that I would even want to display them, which is saying something. Actually, I might even be embarrassed to have them on display, but I learned my lesson and I evolved as a collector, and I do feel like my collection now has a theme to it that I'm aiming for, and hopefully these type of collecting mistakes are a thing of the past. So don't judge me too harshly, and just consider that these were evidence more of growing pains as a collector than anything else. And for me, I figured I would just take a look at them since I do own them, but man, I just wish I could be more positive here. So that's it. I hate to end this one on a downer, but it is what it is, and I can admit when I made a mistake and a bad purchase. Regardless, thanks for watching, and if you are enjoying the content, please consider commenting, liking, and subscribing, and we'll touch base on the next video.